For part 4, we're going to talk about cognitive therapies. And so if we think about our different perspectives on behavior, cognitive perspectives are focusing on the mind and specifically thinking processes. So here, our key figures are going to be Beck and Ellis. Now, because we're talking cognitive therapies, instead of, say, the psychodynamic therapies where we were talking about unconscious roles and factors influencing our behavior, cognitive therapies are going to be focusing a lot more on active cognitive events, meaning things that we can think about. So it's not sort of the lost cause of trying to understand things that we're hiding and repressing and could never connect to because they're deep in our unconscious. With our cognitive therapies, we're focusing on thoughts and ways of thinking that we're experiencing. Now, the important part here is to focus on trying to recognize the role of irrational and self-defeating thought patterns. And the reason why this is important is because, as you have probably figured out in your lives, a lot of our thoughts happen pretty much automatically, or they seem to happen automatically, where we think about something or do something without thinking about how we're doing it. So if I asked you what 5 times 10 is, you could tell me pretty quickly that it's going to be 50, but you didn't necessarily think about the process of multiplying those two numbers together. You just kind of came to that conclusion. And the same thing can happen when we're encountering different events. We can have things like autonomic processing, where we're doing things without thinking about them. This could be issues with stereotypes or whatever. Different types of thoughts that become so ingrained because we do them so often that they kind of run away with us. And so, of course, that can be problematic. So when we're looking at cognitive therapies, we have this idea that clients are often going to need help identifying the different beliefs, ideas, and self-statements that are triggering their maladaptive behaviors and emotions. So what's going on within our thought processes? What is our mind doing that might be underlying the problems that we're having in our lives? And so if you can discover what's going on, maybe we can change how we think about things. So if someone has an eating disorder and that comes from an unhealthy view of food, maybe we can start changing that view with something that's a little bit more adaptive. So the first of these specific types of therapies that we want to talk about is going to be the rational emotive therapy. This one came from Albert Ellis, the first of our 2 names we mentioned on the previous slide. Now, Ellis originally trained as a psychoanalytic therapist. They started in that whole psychodynamic area of things. But they started thinking that the problems that they were seeing weren't from unconscious procedures and events happening sort of under the surface. They figured that there must be some kind of thought involvement, and specifically irrational thoughts, where our thoughts aren't adaptive, that they're not doing what they should be doing. And so this rational emotive therapy is actually based on a theory of emotional disturbance. And so this theory is based on this ABCD model. Sure that there actually were all of those letters. So A, B, C, D. And the idea here is that A stands for the activating event, the thing that triggers the emotion. So this is some kind of stimulus, whether it be internal or external, the thing that causes our response. B is our beliefs, the things that are activated by A. And our belief system is going to underlie the way that we're going to start appraising an event. So if you have, like we just mentioned with an eating disorder, if you have that belief that food is bad, then if the activating event is something like someone offers you food, you're going to frame everything that follows from that perspective that food is bad. We then move to C, which is when we start looking at our consequences, the emotional and behavioral consequences that get produced because of our belief system. So, what is our emotional and behavioral responding that happens because of the way that we've appraised or evaluated the events because of our beliefs? And then D is when we get to disputing. Now, this section D is key to changing maladaptive emotions and behaviors. So when we're disputing something, we're actually going to be challenging. And specifically, we should be focusing on challenging an erroneous belief system. So that's why this arrow is pointing back up here to our beliefs. So if we had an event, it triggered our beliefs, we had a particular outcome, but then we start evaluating it. If we think critically about it, maybe those beliefs weren't quite right. So if we want to change that, we have to dispute them. And so the reason why this model is helpful is because a lot of times when people look at what they're experiencing, how they respond emotionally to a particular event, we don't necessarily think about B. We think about the event that happened, and then we think about our emotional response to it, but we don't necessarily think about why we had that particular response. So if you asked someone out on a date and they say no, and then you feel sad and depressed, you don't necessarily think about, well, why did them saying no make me feel sad and depressed? So how do you change your emotional responding unless you can change why you feel that particular emotion? Now, this is particularly important when we run into things like irrational beliefs. So ideas that are going to underlie maladaptive responses. So beliefs that really don't make sense and that are triggering these maladaptive or problematic responses and emotions in us. So if we have irrational beliefs for this stage, then we need this disputing stage, our D, to try and sort of evaluate and correct those irrational beliefs. So our final stage helps point out errors of thinking. We're framing a situation wrong. If our belief system is wrong, then we should try and point out those errors. And the role of the therapist is to try and help clients identify those irrational beliefs and reprogram those beliefs so that it's no longer an automated gut response. We understand it, we can start changing it, and we can have more healthy, well-structured and adaptive beliefs to reduce our maladaptive responses and have more adaptive responses. So if we change how we frame things, we should be able to change how we respond to things. And that should be a net positive overall for this type of therapy.